Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. Today's video is part of my Back to Basics series where I take specific sewing techniques and I break them down so you can build up a comprehensive library of sewing skills. This video is going to take an up-close look at how to do a clean finish. A clean finish is another way to finish your seam allowance when you're not using a lining but still want a professional look inside your project. I'm going to start a little bit down the line where I've already completed my plain seam. Here you can see me pressing it open. If you aren't sure how to complete a plain seam, go ahead and click the link that's going to pop up on the screen now. But essentially a plain seam refers to just sewing a straight stitch and then pressing open your seam allowance. Once you have your seam allowance pressed open, we're going to take each side of the seam allowance and press it folded under, about 1/4 inch. You can see here that I'm folding the edge of the seam allowance underneath itself, so that way the rough edge will be hidden from view when our seam finish is completed. Take your iron and fold the press in place. Make sure you double check your iron temperature so as not to melt your fabric. And since the area that we're going to be sewing down is so small and precise, pressing that edge nice and clean and crisp is absolutely crucial to the execution of a clean finish. Once you've got the fold on one side pressed, go ahead and do the same thing to the other side of the seam allowance. Once your pressing is complete, we're going to hop over to the sewing machine and stitch both of these folds down. My stitching is going to be about halfway between that inner fold, so at about 1/8 inch. It's a very small area, so taking your time is very important. I also want to point out one of the biggest mistakes I tend to see my students make, which is taking the seam allowance and sewing it down to the outer fabric, creating a line on the outside of your garment. When you've got the fabric in the machine, you only want the seam allowance underneath the presser foot, not any of the outer fabric. Once you've completed one side of the seam allowance, clip your threads and repeat the steps on the other side of the seam allowance. And as always, now that our seam finish is completed, we're going to go back to the ironing board for one final press to really set our seams in place. And here is our lovely clean finish all completed. As you can see, when I flip the fabric over, we don't see any stitching from the outside. Could you stitch all the way through for a design aesthetic? Absolutely. But normally on a clean finish, you don't stitch through all layers of your fabric. You can use this seam finish on any type of project or garment for a beautiful final professional look. Thanks again for stopping by my channel, Meghan Grace DIY. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe and the notify button. And if you found this video helpful, please feel free to check out the other tutorials on my channel. You can also check me out on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. And if you have any questions about this tutorial or suggestions for new tutorials, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And as always, happy sewing!